For most of human history, everyone on Earth had dark skin. That sounds like a simple statement, but it carries an enormous amount of weight behind it. Because if you go back far enough, the pale skin that billions of people carry today didn't exist anywhere on the planet. It wasn't a feature that ancient humans had and then lost. It evolved, relatively recently in specific parts of the world, under specific pressures, for reasons that took scientists a long time to fully work out. And the story of how that happened touches on sunlight, vitamins, ancient migrations, and a handful of genes that quietly rewrote the surface of the human body over thousands of years. To understand why skin color changed, you have to understand why dark skin existed in the first place. Our earliest ancestors lived in Africa, close to the equator, under some of the most intense ultraviolet radiation on the planet. UV radiation is damaging. It breaks down folate, which is a B vitamin that plays a critical role in cell division and the development of healthy pregnancies. A pregnant woman with severely depleted folate levels faces real risks, including neural tube defects in her developing child. So for populations living under a relentless equatorial sun, dark skin wasn't an aesthetic feature. It was a protective shield. The pigment responsible is called melanin, and in high concentrations, it absorbs UV radiation before it can penetrate deep into the skin and destroy folate in the bloodstream. Natural selection is a slow process, but when the stakes are reproductive survival, it moves with purpose. Individuals with more melanin in their skin had better outcomes in high UV environments. Their folate levels stayed more stable, their pregnancies were more likely to succeed. Over thousands of generations, the populations living near the equator were heavily selected for dark, melanin-rich skin. By the time Homo sapiens were fully established as a species in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, dark skin was essentially universal. It was the default. Every human being on the planet carried it. Then people started moving. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa and spreading into new parts of the world. Some went northeast, through the Middle East, and into Central Asia. Others eventually pushed into Europe. And as these populations moved away from the equator, something in their environment changed dramatically. The further north you go, the weaker the sunlight becomes. The angle of the sun flattens out, UV intensity drops, and in winter months, meaningful UV exposure can essentially disappear for weeks at a time. Now here's where the equation flips. Dark skin is exceptional at blocking UV radiation, but when UV levels are low, that same protection becomes a liability. The reason is vitamin D. The human body produces vitamin D through a photochemical reaction in the skin, triggered by UVB radiation from sunlight. Vitamin D is not optional. It's essential for calcium absorption, immune function, and bone development. A severe deficiency can cause rickets in children, weaken bones, and a range of immune problems. In a high UV environment, dark skin blocks just enough radiation to prevent folate destruction while still allowing sufficient vitamin D synthesis. But in a low UV environment, dark skin can block too much, leaving the body unable to produce adequate vitamin D at all. So the pressure flipped. In northern latitudes, lighter skin suddenly had an advantage. People with slightly less melanin could synthesize more vitamin D from the weak northern sun. Their bones were stronger. Their immune systems functioned better. Their children were more likely to survive. Over many generations, populations in low UV environments were selected for reduced melanin production. Skin got lighter. Not overnight, not all at once, but gradually, generation by generation, the populations that settled further from the equator shifted toward lighter pigmentation. The genetics behind this are surprisingly precise. Scientists have identified several key genes involved in skin pigmentation, and two of them do a lot of the heavy lifting. One is a gene called SLC24A5. Researchers discovered that a single mutation in this gene accounts for a significant portion of the difference in skin tone between European and African populations. What's remarkable about this mutation is how recently it spread. Based on genetic analysis, this variant became common in European populations only about 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. That's not ancient history. That's after the pyramids of Göbekli Tepe, after early farming, after most of the major migrations were already underway. Pale skin in Europe is, on a geological scale, an extremely recent development. When researchers first mapped this mutation, it surprised many geneticists. The timescale was so recent that it meant generations alive today are descended from ancestors who would have had significantly darker skin. The shift happened quickly enough that skeletons from different periods in European prehistory show visible changes in bone density and robustness as populations gradually produced more vitamin D. Archaeological evidence from northern European sites shows that as populations became lighter skinned, indicators of nutritional stress and bone-related diseases actually decreased, suggesting that the selection pressure was intense and real. The other major gene is SLC45A2, which also affects melanin production and shows a similar pattern of selection in European populations. Together, these genes suggest that the lightening of European skin wasn't a gradual drift over hundreds of thousands of years. It was a relatively sharp shift that happened in the last several thousand years, likely accelerating as farming populations settled into fixed locations and their diets changed in ways that affected how much vitamin D they were getting from food. Diet turns out to be a really important piece of this. Hunter-gatherers living along coastlines had access to fatty fish, seal meat, and other foods rich in dietary vitamin D. Their diet could partially compensate for the reduced UV exposure at northern latitudes. But when farming spread into Europe around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, diets shifted heavily toward grain. Grain contains almost no vitamin D. Suddenly, populations that had been getting some vitamin D through their food were now depending almost entirely on sunlight. That increased the pressure on skin to become lighter. A farming population in northern Europe with dark skin and a grain-heavy diet was in real metabolic trouble. The selection pressure intensified, and skin lightened faster. The dietary transition was so significant that it reshaped not just skin color, but many other physical adaptations. Populations that adopted farming also began showing increased lactase persistence, a genetic adaptation that allowed them to digest milk into adulthood. Dairy animals became both a food source and a critical source of vitamin D, which likely also contributed to the selection for lighter skin. The two adaptations were intertwined, both driven by the same fundamental shift in how people got their calories and their essential nutrients. There's also an interesting chapter in this story that involves the people who were already living in Europe before the major farming migrations arrived. Genetic studies in the last decade have completely rewritten what we thought we knew about ancient Europeans. For a long time, the assumption was that the pale-skinned people of modern Europe were direct descendants of the first Homo sapiens who arrived there around 40,000 years ago. But ancient DNA analysis has shown something much more complicated. The original hunter-gatherers of Europe, people who lived there for tens of thousands of years, actually had dark skin combined with blue eyes. That combination sounds strange by modern standards, but it was apparently common. The blue eyes came first. Eye color and skin color are controlled by different genetic mechanisms, and the mutation responsible for blue eyes spread through European hunter-gatherers long before the genes for light skin became dominant. So for a long stretch of European prehistory, you had populations with relatively dark skin, blue eyes, and dark hair living across the continent. The light skin came later, carried in by waves of farmers migrating out of Anatolia, the region that is now Turkey, and mixing with the existing hunter-gatherer populations. The combination of their genes, under continued selection pressure for vitamin D synthesis, produced the lighter skinned populations that would eventually become modern Europeans. This mixing was not instantaneous or simple. Genetic studies show that it took over 1,000 years for the farming populations to completely replace or integrate with the existing hunter-gatherer groups, and the different regions of Europe experienced this process at different times. Meanwhile, a completely different version of this story was playing out in East Asia. East Asian populations also evolved lighter skin compared to sub-Saharan Africans, but through entirely different genetic pathways. The mutations that lighten skin in Europe are largely absent in East Asian populations and vice versa. This is a textbook example of convergent evolution, where two separate populations faced a similar environmental challenge and arrived at a similar solution through completely different biological routes. The destination looked the same from the outside, but the roads taken were entirely distinct. The Arctic populations complicate the picture even further. The Inuit and other indigenous groups living in extremely high latitudes have moderately dark skin relative to other northern populations, despite living in places with almost no UV radiation for months at a time. The reason is diet. Traditional Arctic diets are heavily based on marine mammals, fish, and organs, all of which are rich in dietary vitamin D. When your food supply covers your vitamin D needs, the selection pressure on skin color to lighten is reduced. You can maintain darker skin without the metabolic penalty. Their skin pigmentation reflects not just latitude, but the specific foods their ancestors ate for thousands of years. In South Asia, populations show a wide range of skin tones that reflect a complex history of migrations, mixtures, and local adaptations. The subcontinent received waves of migrants from different directions over thousands of years, each carrying different pigmentation genes, and the result is a gradient rather than a clear divide. Populations in southern India, closer to the equator and under stronger UV exposure, tend to have darker skin. Populations further north tend to be lighter, and within those broad patterns, there's enormous variation, produced by millennia of mixing. It's worth being clear about what skin color is not. It's not a measure of ancestry depth, cultural sophistication, or biological complexity. Every population on Earth has skin that is precisely calibrated to the UV environment their ancestors lived in for thousands of years. Dark skin evolved because it was the right tool for a high radiation environment. Light skin evolved because it was the right tool for a low radiation environment. The entire variation in human skin color, from the darkest to the palest, is driven by a handful of genes responding to a single environmental variable. The differences that seem so significant on the surface are, at a biological level, remarkably shallow. Recent research has continued to push the timeline and sharpen the picture. Studies published in the last few years have used ancient DNA from skeletal remains across Europe, Africa, and Asia to track exactly when specific pigmentation variants spread through different populations. The data keeps pointing to the same conclusion. Light skin in Europe is young, it spread fast. And it spread because the farming transition created new dietary conditions that made the pressure for lighter skin stronger than it had ever been during the hunter-gatherer period. There are still open questions. Scientists are still working out exactly how many genes are involved in the full spectrum of human skin color, because the variants identified so far don't explain all of the variation that exists. There are likely additional genes, some still uncharacterized, that contribute smaller effects across different populations. The genetics of pigmentation is a field that's still actively being mapped, and every few years, a new study adds another layer of complexity to what seemed like a settled question. What's clear is the core mechanism. Humans started with dark skin because they needed protection from a powerful sun. They spread into environments where that sun was weaker. Their bodies faced new pressure to produce vitamin D, and the populations that carried mutations reducing melanin had better health outcomes and more surviving children. Over thousands of years, those mutations became the norm in northern populations. The further the migration, the weaker the sun, the stronger the pressure, and the lighter the skin became. It's one of the most well-documented examples of recent human evolution, and it happened well within the span of recorded human history.